The first time I saw him, I wasn't looking for anyone, least of all him. It was late autumn, the kind of gray day that sits heavy on your skin and makes everything feel like a half-remembered dream. The sky had been threatening rain since morning, and by the time I pulled into the old shelter on the outskirts of town, the first drops had already begun to fall, soft and cold against the windshield. I almost didn't go in. I almost turned around, drove back to the small, quiet apartment where no one waited for me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the silence of the car, or the way the rain sounded like a whisper against the glass. Whatever it was, it made me open the door and step out into the wet wind. The shelter was a collection of fading red buildings surrounded by chain-link fences and the smell of damp straw. Inside, the light was yellow and tired. The woman at the counter looked up and smiled, her face framed by years of gentle wear. "You here to adopt?" she asked. I hesitated, fingers still clutching the strap of my bag. "I'm not sure," I said. "Maybe just to look." "Sometimes that's all it takes," she said, with the kind of smile that knows too much. She led me down a narrow hall lined with metal kennels. The air was thick with the scent of soap and fur and loneliness. Dogs barked and whined, tails wagging, eyes pleading. I tried to meet each gaze, but it was overwhelming. Too much need, too much noise. And then, at the far end of the row, in a stall half in shadow, I saw him. He wasn't barking. He wasn't moving. He just sat there, still, watchful, his eyes following me as I walked closer. His fur was black with streaks of silver, his ears slightly too big for his head. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were a color I didn't have a name for. Something between amber and stormlight. Something that felt like memory. "What's his name?" I asked. "Shadow?" the woman said softly. "Found him by the river about 3 months ago. He doesn't trust easy." I crouched near the gate, careful not to get too close. He tilted his head, curious but cautious. "Hey," I whispered. "You don't have to come over." But he did. Slowly. Step by careful step until he was close enough that I could see the fine line of a scar running across his muzzle. And then, just when I thought he'd turn away, he pressed his nose against my hand. The world went quiet. It wasn't dramatic, not really. But something in me shifted. A crack, a release, a warmth spreading where the cold used to live. I'd been numb for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to feel. But that simple touch, soft, hesitant, real, undid me. I melted. By the time I left that day, Shadow was in the back seat of my car. The shelter woman had said, "He picked you," and I hadn't known how to argue. I didn't plan for it. I didn't have food or bowls or even a leash. But he sat there like he'd been waiting for this all along, eyes on the window, watching the world blur by. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of the wipers and his slow, steady breathing. Every few miles I glanced at him, half expecting him to vanish, some dream conjured by my loneliness. But he stayed, real and quiet, his gaze following the rain as it slid across the glass. When we reached the apartment, he hesitated at the threshold. I knelt beside him. "It's not much," I said, voice softer than I expected. "But it's warm." He stepped inside. That night I couldn't sleep. The apartment was too still, too full of new energy. Shadow had curled himself in the corner of the living room, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. I lay on the couch, blanket tangled around me, listening to the rhythm of his breath. It matched mine, slow, even, safe. At some point I must have drifted off because when I woke, he was standing beside me. The first light of dawn painted the walls pale blue, and his silhouette looked almost human in the quiet. He lowered his head, sniffed the air near my hand, then, with infinite gentleness, pressed his nose against my palm again. I smiled without meaning to. "Morning," I whispered. He blinked, tail flicking once, as if to say, "We made it through the night." Over the next weeks, we built a rhythm. I worked from home, editing photos for clients who never saw my face. and he followed me from room to room, always near but never demanding. He had this way of existing beside me that felt like peace. I learned his habits, how he preferred to drink water from the corner of the bowl, how he'd stare at his reflection in the window whenever it rained, how he slept with one paw covering his nose. And he learned me, when I needed quiet, when I needed to be touched. He seemed to know before I did. The first time he barked was 2 weeks after I brought him home. I was sitting on the balcony, wrapped in an old sweater, watching the sky turn pink over the city. A car alarm went off below, sharp, jarring. Shadow, who'd been lying at my feet, stood suddenly, his whole body tensing. The bark that left him was deep and fierce, so loud it startled me. I reached out instinctively. "Hey, it's okay." He turned to look at me, chest still heaving. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped closer, pressing his head against my knee. The sound that left him wasn't a growl or a whine. It was something in between. Something like apology. "It's all right," I said, my fingers finding the soft fur behind his ears. "You don't have to protect me." But even as I said it, I knew he would. Always. Winter came early that year. The mornings were cold enough that our breath hung in clouds, and the trees along the street stood bare and brittle. I bought Shadow a thick blue collar with his name etched in silver. The first time I put it on him, he held still, patient, eyes fixed on mine. "Handsome," I said, and he wagged his tail once, like a secret shared. Our walks became our ritual. Before dawn and after dusk, the world hushed except for the sound of his paws on the pavement. He'd walk just ahead of me, glancing back every few steps as if to make sure I was still there. I always was. Sometimes strangers would stop to pet him. "Beautiful dog," they'd say. "He's got kind eyes." I'd smile, but inside I'd think, he has eyes that see everything. The first snow fell in early December. Thick, slow flakes that drifted down like pieces of silence. Shadow had never seen snow before, at least not that I knew of. When I opened the door that morning, he froze at the sight of it, nose twitching. "Go on," I said. "It's okay." He stepped out cautiously, sniffed, then looked back at me with that same bewildered wonder I felt the first time I saw the ocean as a child. I laughed, really laughed, and he took off running, bounding through the white drifts, his tail a banner behind him. For a few minutes, the world was nothing but joy. No past, no future, just motion and light. I chased after him, slipping and falling and laughing until my breath came in bursts of steam. When I finally caught up, he turned and barreled into me, knocking me down into the snow. I lay there, breathless, as he stood over me, his fur dusted white, his eyes bright with mischief. He leaned down and pressed his cold, wet nose against my cheek. It should have been nothing, a moment like any other. But it wasn't. It was everything, because in that second, lying in the snow with his heartbeat close enough to hear, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. He'd found the part of me I thought had died. The one that still believed in warmth. In connection. In being seen. That night, as he slept curled at the foot of the bed, I thought about how strange it was, how one small act of trust could change everything. I hadn't realized how long I'd been living half alive, moving through days that all looked the same. But Shadow, without words, without promises, had given me back the color in the world. Sometimes, I'd catch myself watching him and wondering who had hurt him before, what kind of silence he'd learned to survive in. He'd flinch at sudden movements, avoid loud noises, and though he never growled, there was a wariness in his eyes that only time could heal. I knew that look too well. I wore it once, so I made him a promise, quietly one night as the city hummed outside our window. "I'll be patient," I said. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He lifted his head, eyes glowing in the half-light, and placed his paw on my knee. That was answer enough. The weeks that followed blurred into warmth. Coffee mornings, snowy evenings, the small rituals that make a life. We didn't need much, just space to breathe, to exist together. On New Year's Eve, fireworks burst above the city. Shadow trembled at the first explosion, trying to hide behind the couch. I sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. His body was tense, but he didn't run. "It's just noise," I whispered. "It'll pass." The booms echoed through the night. I felt each tremor through his frame. I hummed softly, an old lullaby my mother used to sing. Something about stars and rivers. Slowly, he began to relax, his breathing evening out. When the last firework faded, he lifted his head and pressed it against my chest. We stayed like that for a long time. The world outside reduced to smoke and silence. In that quiet, I realized something. He didn't just need me. I needed him. Not because I was broken, but because love, the kind that heals, isn't about being fixed. It's about being seen in your stillness and accepted anyway. Sometimes I think about that first day, the rain, the hesitation, the moment he pressed his nose against my hand. How something so small could rearrange everything inside me. Now, when I wake, he's there, stretched across the rug, one paw twitching in dreams. When I leave, he watches from the window until I return, and every time I open the door, he greets me like I'm the only thing that matters in the world. I don't know what I expected when I walked into that shelter. Maybe I just wanted to feel something again. Maybe I was looking for forgiveness. But what I found was far more simple. The quiet miracle of being chosen by something pure. And though the world keeps turning, though storms still come and hearts still break, I've learned this much. Sometimes salvation doesn't roar. It doesn't speak. It just presses its nose against your hand and waits for you to melt. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like an ache fading from the bones. The snow along the sidewalks turned to slush, the rooftops dripped, and the morning smelled faintly of thawing earth. For the first time in months, the light felt softer, as though the world was trying to forgive itself for the cold it had carried. Shadow seemed to feel it too. His energy shifted with the season, more restless, more alive. He'd press his nose to the window each morning, watching the sparrows return, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Sometimes I'd catch him tilting his head toward the sound of melting ice sliding off the gutters, as if listening to the world being reborn. I understood that feeling, that hunger for change, that quiet urge to run without knowing where to. Winter had kept me still, but now the air called for motion, for renewal. So I began to walk further. Every afternoon after finishing my work, I'd clip on his leash and we'd wander beyond the familiar streets, down through the narrow alleys where sunlight cut through like golden blades, past the edge of town where the pavement ended and fields began. There was something sacred in those walks. We didn't talk. Of course we couldn't. But we didn't need to. I spoke through small gestures, a hand brushing his back, a laugh when he leapt at shadows, a sigh when the wind shifted. And he spoke through silence, the steady rhythm of his paws on dirt, the way he'd pause beside me when I stopped, the occasional glance that felt like reassurance. It was strange, how easy it had become. How natural. I used to think connection required words. But with Shadow, I'd learned that sometimes the truest language is the one spoken through presence. By late February, the city began to hum again. Cars returning to the streets, people stepping out from hibernation. The cafes reopened their patios, the parks filled with laughter, and the air smelled of coffee and wet stone. That's when I met Daniel. It happened on a Thursday morning. Shadow and I were walking near the river, his favorite path, when he stopped abruptly, ears pricking forward. Before I could react, he tugged the leash and bounded toward something around the bend. "Shadow!" I shouted, running after him. When I turned the corner, I saw him, a tall man crouched by the water, his hands extended as Shadow pressed his nose into them. The man looked up, startled but smiling. His jacket was worn, his hair windblown, his eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. "Sorry," I gasped, jogging over. "He doesn't usually—" "It's all right," he said, still kneeling. "He just surprised me. He's beautiful. He's new," I said, catching my breath, still learning manners. He chuckled, rubbing behind Shadow's ears. "Aren't we all?" His voice was warm, grounded. The kind that makes you feel known even in silence. I didn't plan to see him again. But life, as I'd learned, rarely asked for permission. The next morning, he was there again, sitting on the same bench by the river, a thermos in hand, feeding crumbs to the ducks. Shadow spotted him first, tail wagging like recognition. Daniel smiled when he saw us. "Your partner in crime," he said, nodding toward Shadow. "Back for another adventure?" "He insists on this path now," I said, laughing softly. "I think he's decided it's his. Then I guess I'm trespassing." I sat beside him. We talked about nothing and everything. The weather, the quiet charm of small towns, how silence feels different when shared. He told me he worked as a carpenter. Hands are always busy, but the mind, sometimes too quiet, he said. I told him about photography, how I'd stopped taking pictures after my mother died, how I'd only recently started again. "He's the reason," I said, glancing at Shadow. "He makes the world look worth capturing again." Daniel smiled, that small, knowing kind of smile. "Then he's doing more for you than you realize." Over the next weeks, our walks became intertwined with his presence. Sometimes Daniel would join us, his stride matching mine, Shadow trotting happily between us. Other days he'd be waiting by the river, coffee steaming in the cold air. It felt easy, that wordless companionship, the kind that fills the spaces you didn't know were empty. But ease, I'd learned, can be fragile. One evening near sunset, the clouds thickened without warning. The light dimmed and the wind rose, sharp and sudden. Shadow stiffened beside me. The first thunderclap split the air and he bolted, leash slipping from my grasp. "Shadow!" The world spun into panic. The street echoed with his name, my boots slapping against wet pavement, my voice breaking into the growing storm. I turned corner after corner, calling, searching. But all I saw was rain. By the time Daniel found me, I was soaked through, standing in the middle of the empty road. "He'll find his way back," Daniel said, grabbing my shoulders gently. "He's smart." "He's scared," I choked out. "He hates storms." He didn't argue. He just nodded, and together we searched, through alleys, fields, and the edge of the forest behind the town. The rain blurred everything, the world reduced to shadow and sound. Hours passed. When we finally found him, he was under the old railway bridge, trembling, his fur matted with mud. I dropped to my knees, calling his name softly. He looked up, and in that instant, every ounce of fear melted into recognition. He stumbled toward me, collapsing into my arms. His body shook against mine, his heart hammering wild and fast. "It's okay," I whispered, burying my face in his neck. "You're safe. You're home." Daniel crouched beside us, his voice quiet. He knew where to wait, somewhere he could still see the lights. When I looked up, the storm had begun to fade. The rain softened to drizzle. The sky opened just enough to show a sliver of moon. After that night, Shadow never left my side. Even in sleep, I'd feel the weight of him at my feet, the warmth of his body grounding me. The storm had shaken something loose in both of us, a fear I didn't want to name. The fear of losing what you love again. Daniel became part of our rhythm after that. Sometimes he'd come by the apartment, bringing fresh bread, or the smell of sawdust and pine. Shadow adored him, though he'd always keep one paw resting near me, as if reminding us both where his loyalty began. One afternoon, Daniel brought me an old wooden frame he'd carved himself. "For one of your photos," he said. "Something worth remembering." I hesitated before answering. "Everything feels worth remembering lately." "Then you're living right," he said with a soft smile. I didn't tell him that living right scared me, that happiness had become something I didn't trust. But maybe he already knew. Some people just know. Spring arrived in a rush of color, trees blooming, air thick with the scent of wet grass. Shadow grew restless again, drawn to every scent, every rustle. I let him lead. We spent entire days outdoors, hiking along the river, exploring abandoned trails. I took photos again, of light breaking through branches, of puddles reflecting the sky, of him. Always him. He'd sit still for me sometimes, as though he understood the importance of stillness. Other times he'd dart into the frame, blurring into motion. Both versions of him, the calm and the wild, felt like truth. Daniel would join us when he could. The three of us would walk until the sun fell low, then sit in quiet. I never said it aloud, but I started to imagine a life built around that. The simplicity of shared silence. And yet, part of me resisted. Because love, in all its forms, meant risk, and I wasn't sure I could survive another loss. One evening in April, we found a stray on the outskirts of town, a thin golden retriever, limping, terrified. Shadow noticed first, his ears perking, a low whine in his throat. I knelt, whispering softly, inching closer until the dog let me touch him. He was hurt, a deep cut along his hind leg. Without thinking, I took off my scarf, wrapped it gently around the wound, and called Daniel for help. We brought him to the vet, waited together in the sterile light of the clinic. Shadow sat by my feet the whole time, watching the other dog with quiet intensity. When the vet finally came out, he said, "He'll make it. Lucky you found him." I exhaled, realizing how tightly I'd been holding my breath. That night, as we walked home, Daniel said, "You couldn't walk away, could you?" "I wouldn't know how," I said softly. He smiled. "That's what makes you you." When I looked down, Shadow was walking close beside me, head brushing my hand with every step, a silent promise that neither of us would ever walk alone again. The new dog, we named him Rust, stayed at the shelter. But I visited often. Sometimes Daniel came too. Shadow would wait patiently outside the pen, tail wagging, as if recognizing a story that mirrored his own. Seeing Rust heal reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. That love, at its core, is not about keeping. It's about returning someone, or something, to themselves. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, I realized how much I'd changed. The woman who'd walked into that shelter months ago, lost, closed off, half alive, would hardly recognize this version of me, and maybe that's what healing looks like. Not a sudden transformation, but a quiet unfolding, one heartbeat at a time. Shadow pressed his nose against my hand, grounding me. Always grounding me. I turned toward the horizon and whispered, "Let's go home," he barked once, short, bright, certain, and in that sound, I heard everything, the past, the present, and the promise of whatever waited next. The air that evening was heavier than usual, not with heat, but with the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The fields were quiet, the horizon smudged with violet, and Shadow walked beside me, his gait slow, deliberate, his nose brushing the grass as if memorizing every scent before night fell. We had just left the shelter. Rust had been adopted earlier that morning, a family with 2 kids, laughter spilling down the hallway as they knelt to pet him. I had smiled, even as something in my chest twisted. Letting go never stopped hurting, no matter how right it felt. Shadow had stayed close the whole time, leaning into my leg when the goodbye became too much. Now, as we walked back toward home, I could feel his warmth through the fabric of my jeans. Steady, grounding, wordless. The first drop of rain hit the back of my hand, then another. The storm arrived fast, a sudden curtain of water, cold and relentless. I started to run, tugging at the leash, but Shadow resisted, planting his feet in the mud, tail down, eyes fixed on something ahead. "What is it?" I asked, breath catching. He didn't move. And then I saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. The old oak tree by the bend, the one where we always stopped on our walks, had been struck. The trunk glowed faintly where the lightning had torn through it, smoke curling upward into the dark. I froze. The air smelled of rain and charred wood. My heart raced, half in fear, half in awe. The storm raged around us, but all I could see was the tree. Ancient, scarred, still standing. Shadow took a step forward, pulling me gently. It felt like a message. "Go on. Don't hide from the fire. Face it." So we did. By the time we reached it, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. The damage was worse up close. Bark split open, the ground scorched. I ran my hand along the trunk, feeling the warmth still radiating from where lightning had found it. It was strange, how something could be both broken and alive. "Maybe that's what we are," I whispered. Shadow pressed his nose into my palm. The touch was soft, grounding, the same gesture that had started everything between us. And in that moment I realized this was the circle closing. Not the end, but the echo of a beginning. The days after the storm felt like waking from a dream. The town buzzed about the lightning strike, but to me it felt personal, as though the sky had tried to speak, and I was the only one who'd heard. Daniel stopped by the next evening, rain still clinging to his jacket. He stood in the doorway, the scent of pine and damp air following him. "I came to check on you," he said, voice low. "I heard the storm hit near here." "We're fine," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Just a little shaken." Shadow trotted over to greet him, tail wagging. Daniel bent to rub his neck, smiling. "He's your guardian, isn't he?" "He's more than that," I said softly. "He's my compass." Daniel looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "You seem lighter lately, like you found something you weren't looking for." Maybe I did. We talked until the sky turned indigo. When he left, Shadow watched from the window until the headlights disappeared down the road. I stood beside him, hand resting on his back. The house felt full, not because of who was in it, but because of what it held. Memory, warmth, quiet understanding. Spring bled into summer. The world turned green again, full of promise. I began taking freelance jobs farther out of town. Small farms, family portraits, landscapes that shimmered with sunlight and dust. Shadow came everywhere with me. He was more than a companion. He was my lens. I started capturing the world the way he saw it. From the ground up, through patience and curiosity. Children loved him. Farmers offered him scraps of bread and called him gentleman. In every photo I took, he was somewhere in the background, a blur of fur, a shadow in the corner, a presence you felt even when you didn't see. People began to ask about him. "That dog," one client said, pointing at a picture of a sunrise over the river. "He looks like he's guarding the light." "He is," I said. But life, like light, has its shadows. One evening in late July, we returned from a long day of shooting at a nearby orchard. The sun was low, the air thick with the smell of peaches and dust. Shadow was quiet on the ride home, his head resting against the window. When we got inside, he hesitated before climbing the stairs. I thought he was tired, so I coaxed him gently, but he just stood there, eyes distant. Later that night, I found him lying by the back door, breathing heavier than usual. "Hey," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "You okay?" He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was fear in his eyes. Not panic, just quiet confusion. The vet said it was his heart. "He's strong," she said gently, "but age and stress can catch up fast. You've given him a good life. That's what matters." Her words echoed for days, like stones dropped into still water. I did everything I could: medication, rest, careful walks at sunrise. But I could feel time shifting around us, soft and unstoppable. Some nights he'd crawl closer to me, his head on my lap, his breathing steady but shallow. I'd stroke his fur and whisper stories about the first day we met, about the snow, about the storm. He'd listen, eyes half closed, as if memorizing the sound of my voice, and always, before sleep, he'd press his nose against my hand. The same touch, the same promise. By late August, the heat broke. The days grew shorter again, the fields pale with gold. One morning I woke to find him standing by the door, leash in his mouth, tail wagging softly. It was the first time in weeks he'd asked to go out. We drove to the river, our river. The air was cool, the water slow and shimmering. He walked beside me, slower now, but proud. Every few steps, he'd stop and look at me, as if checking that I was still there. When we reached the bench where I'd first met Daniel, Shadow lay down beside it, head resting on my foot. The breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. I sat there for a long time, running my fingers through his fur. "You've done enough," I whispered. "You can rest if you need to." He looked up at me, eyes soft, knowing. Then he pressed his nose against my hand, one last time, and I melted all over again. The world blurred, light, sound, breath, until all that remained was the warmth of him, the rhythm of our shared heartbeat, and then stillness. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, hand resting on his fur, feeling the echo of him in the air. The river moved slowly beside us, carrying the light forward. When I finally stood, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The sky burned with colors that shouldn't exist, deep red fading into violet and gold. I took a photo. The frame caught the reflection of the water, the empty bench, and a shadow, faint, soft, eternal, resting at my feet. Weeks passed. The house felt different, not empty, but transformed. His toys still sat in the corner. His collar hung by the door. But the silence he left behind wasn't loneliness. It was peace. One morning, a letter arrived from the shelter. Inside was a simple note. "We have another who needs you. No rush. Just when you're ready." I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked at the photograph on the wall, the one of the river at sunset. In the reflection, if you looked closely, you could see him, always there. I smiled. Later that afternoon, I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and stepped into the light. The air was warm, the scent of summer fading into fall. As I walked down the path, a breeze rose, soft and playful. It brushed against my hand, gentle, familiar. For a second, I could almost feel him there again, pressing his nose against my skin. And I melted. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude. Because love, I finally understood, doesn't vanish when breath does. It lingers, in memory, in the shape of sunlight through trees, in the rhythm of footsteps beside you when you think you're alone. It becomes everything. Now, years later, I still walk the same path. There's a new dog at my side, smaller, curious, with eyes full of mischief. But every so often, when the wind shifts just right, he pauses, looks over his shoulder, and wags his tail at the empty space behind us. And I know that somewhere, just beyond what I can see, Shadow is still there, guarding the light, watching the world he left brighter than he found it. I whisper his name to the air. It carries on the breeze, through the fields, across the river. The sun breaks through the clouds, and in that light, I see him again, running wild and free, his shadow stretching long across the golden grass. Not gone, just home. The wind rose again, curling through the grass in waves, carrying the smell of earth and rain. I stood there watching the horizon blur into color. That endless space where memory becomes light. The young dog beside me barked once, sharp and bright, as if answering something unseen. "Do you see him too?" I whispered. My voice didn't tremble anymore. It felt steady, anchored by everything we'd lived through. We began to walk again, slow, deliberate steps toward the hill that overlooked the farm. The sun sank lower, brushing the world in gold. The river shimmered in the distance, a thread of silver winding through the land. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of wind in the wheat, the beating of wings somewhere overhead. Life was loud again, not in chaos, but in presence. When we reached the top of the hill, I sat down, legs folded beneath me, the dog resting against my side. For a while, neither of us moved. The air felt heavy with memory, all the echoes of the years that had shaped this place. The laughter, the storms, the quiet mornings that had built a life from loss. I thought about the first day I met Shadow, the smell of rain, the hum of fluorescent lights in the shelter, the soft press of his nose against my hand. That single moment had rewritten everything I thought I knew about love. It had taught me that salvation doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks on four legs and breathes quietly beside you until you remember what your own heart sounds like. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo. I'd taken the day he left, the sunset over the river. The image had faded a little from being handled too much, but the colors were still there. The glow, the reflection, the faint outline of him that lived inside the light. I smiled and set it on the grass. The breeze lifted the edges, then stilled. "Thank you," I said softly. The young dog stirred, raising his head, his fur brushing my arm. I looked at him and saw not replacement but continuation, the next verse of a song that never truly ends. His eyes, bright and unafraid, held the same kind of trust that had once saved me. "Come on," I murmured. "Let's go home." We walked down the hill together, the sky burning behind us. The first stars began to appear, faint at first, then stronger, constellations forming out of the dusk. One of them, faint but certain, looked like the curve of a paw print against the heavens. I laughed under my breath. "I see you," I whispered, and in the cool breath of the evening, something answered. Not sound, not wind, but warmth. The kind that fills you from the inside out. By the time we reached the gate, the world had gone still again. The air smelled of rain and grass and something eternal. I turned once more toward the field, the stars now bright above it, and whispered the only truth that ever mattered. Love doesn't end. It just changes form. The breeze carried it away, across the fields, through the trees, over the river, until it was part of everything, and somewhere out there I knew he was running still.